So before we go any further talking about dependency inversion, we should consider what exactly are dependencies. Obviously, if you're writing .NET software, you have taken a dependency on the .NET platform, the .NET framework, more or less on Windows, unless you're developing for Mono. And this is something that is not, within the scope of dependency inversion per se. It's a dependency that you're probably pretty comfortable with and that you don't expect to change too much with the course of your software. However, the dependencies we're talking about with regard to our application design are more low level and things that we are going to expect to possibly change as part of our application during its lifetime. For example, access to third-party libraries. These can often be things that will change frequently, and therefore, if possible, we want to be able to inject alternate implementations of these third-party libraries into our code, unless we're certain that our choice of third-party libraries is not likely to change for the lifetime of our application. Certainly, our database represents a dependency, assuming that our application has one, and it's definitely one of the things that you will want to wrap in such a way that it is not an implicit dependency within your code, but rather something that could be injected and replaced. We'll see more about how to do that soon. Other dependencies are less obvious. For example, if your code references the file system, if it uses email, if it sends email or even checks email from a POP mailbox, for example, if it uses web services or really any kind of network access at all would be a dependency as well. Any sort of system resources, even things like just the clock that you might access via datetime.now represent further dependencies that might require you to invert in the case of situations where they affect the behavior of your application and there's no way for you to test it unless you run it at certain times of day. Configuration can be a dependency in terms of the files that you use for configuring your application. The new keyword is itself a possible indication that you've got a dependency within your application. You want to limit the places in which you allow your application to instantiate new objects, unless they're primitives like strings, for example. And related to that is the use of static methods. Anytime you're calling a static method, you're adding a dependency to your code that cannot easily be separated from the calling code in the case of trying to write a test for it, or in the case of wanting to change your code, the way your code works throughout the entire application in one place. If you have static methods sprinkled throughout your code, it's very difficult to change them all through one configuration change or one startup file change. Thread.sleep can also be a dependency, as well as the use of random. It can be very difficult to test code that is supposed to give you random results. So if you specify an interface that you use for generating your random values, then in your test you can override that interface and say, well, if the random value is this, then I should expect this result. And similarly, it allows you to more easily test so-called random data. These are some of the dependencies that you should be aware of. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think I've covered most of the major ones that you'll typically find in a .NET business application.